Hello and welcome to season 2, episode 13 of Social Anxiety Live. This is the podcast where we explore all things related to social anxiety, what it is, how it shows up, and how we navigate life with it. I'm Simon.
And I'm Sarah. Today's episode is one we've both been looking forward to because, let's be honest, it's a situation that puts our social anxiety front and centre.
Yes, we're talking about that moment when somebody says, I listen to your podcast. What do you say? How do you react? And why does it feel like a really intense social anxiety test?
If you've ever had your work or something personal brought up unexpectedly, you'll definitely relate to this one. So let's get started.
Now, unusually for this episode, we purposely didn't ask for any listener contributions for this one because this episode feels more personal than previous ones that we've done. So let's start with when someone tells you that you've listened to the podcast, what's going through your head when that happens?
You know, it's always a really nice feeling when someone says that they've listened to our podcast, but it's always mixed as well with a little bit of anxiety or a bit of panic for me. I think when someone says that they've listened to our podcast, I immediately jump to, oh my goodness, okay, that's a very personal thing that I talk about on the podcast. You know, I don't talk super openly with loads of people about it, but obviously I'm doing a podcast. So it's a bit surprising when people maybe I don't know so well bring it up, and I feel a bit anxious thinking, gosh, they've listened to it. What have I said? You know, those sort of worries do come to the forefront, as lovely as it is.
You know, in the early days when we did those early episodes and, you know, I was telling people, family, friends, acquaintances that I was doing a podcast about social anxiety. Now, when they listened to it for the first time, it was the reaction that we got from it. Like some people would say, oh, I would never have guessed, or I didn't think that at all. I didn't realise that at all. And it feels like you're sharing a sort of like a secret, private side of you that people don't know about. And it puts you really much on the spot when people are talking about it, even though it's something that, you know, you've done, you know, a lot about. And let's face it, it's publicly out there. Anybody in any part of the world could listen to this. So it's very much, it does put you on the spot.
And I think some really nice conversations have come out of it. I know when we first started the podcast, as you said, people would say, wow, I've never would have expected that you had social anxiety. I think we've had mutual friends that have said, oh yes, I really resonated with some of the things that you talked about. And I think that was even surprising to us that certain people that maybe we would see as quite extrovert or confident actually said, no, I actually really related to a lot of the things you said in your podcast. So those conversations are always really nice.
And things like you don't plan to share these things with people. Like when we sit here and do the recording, I don't have anyone particularly in mind when we're talking about it. I mean, when we have contributions, I do think of that particular person. But, you know, we don't plan who we're speaking to when we do these podcasts. And, you know, when the person says to us, I've listened to your podcast, and they give their reaction to it, sometimes I struggle with what to say back to them. Because in my head I'm thinking, oh my goodness, they've listened to it. So do they listen to all of it? Do they listen to a little bit of it? And it goes back to one of our talked about episodes about the overthinking. Would you overthink when someone talks to you about listening to our podcast?
Yeah. I mean, I've had people that I don't know particularly well say, oh, how's the podcast going? And I sort of, once I've said, yeah, it's going well, I then really think I don't really know what else to say about it. I sort of, as you said, I think I start to overthink, and I'm not quite sure how in depth I should go, because how much have they listened to? Do they listen to it regularly? Are they just being polite?
Yeah, because I think the theory is there are people who have listened to the first episode and that was enough for them. And then in contrast, there's people who've listened to every single episode that we've done, and they set their little alerts on their chosen podcast platform and they get notified about when it comes through.
And they contribute regularly and engage.
So it's almost, there's a mixture of, thank you for listening, but almost it's uneasiness at the same time because you've let these people in onto something that you don't often talk about, and you worry about what they're going to say in response to it. I think that probably sums it up.
Yeah. So would you say if someone brings up the podcast to you, that it triggers your social anxiety?
I'll be honest, I don't think it does. It doesn't trigger social anxiety, but I get more anxious probably the more I talk about it
Yeah.
and what I'm getting from the other person. Because, I can remember going to a social event and someone invited me to this lovely social event and it was for the launch of their book. And if that person's listening, they'll know exactly who I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But during this event, this person has set up lots of little areas for people to get engaged in terms of like there's little activities. And I remember that I sat down at one of these particular activities and I think it was like a Play-Doh activity and I was having quite a nice sensory break, but someone started making conversation. I was like, oh, for goodness sake, please don't do small talk for ages. But he talked about a podcast that he did, and I thought, okay, well, I can talk about my podcast that I do, and so that sort of links the conversation together. Because I think if you identify or diagnose as neurodivergent, you're waiting for those cues, particularly those cues, to be able to contribute towards the conversation. And I did speak about our podcast, and his reaction was, "Oh, that's really good. You're doing that. So, what's it called? And can I find it on Spotify? Can I find it on Apple? Whatever." And I saw him. He got his phone out and started bookmarked it on his phone. So that's a real example for me of there was that mixture of talking positively about it, but I felt I still got anxiety about having that conversation with that person. So I suppose, in a way, talking about the podcast, there is a trigger there, but it's almost a positive and a slightly not so positive trigger.
Yeah, I think there's an argument to be said about as well the context, like where you are or who it is that brings it up. Because if I'm with someone I'm quite close to and they bring up the podcast, I'm very comfortable talking about it. Whereas I had a situation where I was at work and someone brought it up. And I found that more difficult because the podcast is such a personal thing. You're talking about something that, is a real thing that at times can be something that we struggle with. And so someone at work bringing up the fact that I think they had only listened to maybe the first episode. I don't believe they've listened to any since then. But just them saying, I listened to your podcast about your anxiety. It kind of, I don't want to say it panicked me, but it did feel uncomfortable. I think because for me, work and personal life are quite separate. And I like it that way. So someone in my workspace saying, I have listened to you talk about something you really struggle with, and now I know this about you. It sort of took me a minute. I think I was a bit taken aback and I didn't quite know how to respond because I didn't want to sort of have a full conversation at work about it. So that was a very different feeling to when I've maybe had it brought up when I'm in a group of friends or I'm out having a drink or something.
Is there a worry then that the person at work who listened to your podcast, is there a worry that their perception of you changes after listening to your podcast? Because I'm sure there's the work version of you, there's the social version, and then maybe the podcast version is slightly different to those two. So is there anxiety around what they think about you after listening to the podcast?
Yeah, I suppose it could be that. And also sort of, I think over the years we've both become much more comfortable talking about our social anxiety, and the podcast is a big reason for that. But I don't necessarily feel super comfortable talking about my social anxiety with people I'm not particularly close to, or maybe if it's someone that, I find it easy when I'm talking to someone who I can see is genuinely interested and wants to know about it and wants to learn about it, or if it's someone who, also has it. But I feel like that situation was just very much someone saying, yeah, listen to your podcast, but not necessarily any engagement with it or understanding of it. And so for me, it was quite easy to say, oh, amazing, thank you so much, and kind of leave it there.
Yeah, it's almost there's different levels of engagement and response to it. I think closer people, I tend to give more information because I can sort of read whether they want to know more about it. And then there's people who I had someone at work that said to me they listened to the podcast, or they were going to listen to it. And then I immediately thought, how I don't have any direct connection with you apart from work. So I thought, how would you have found out about it? Then I thought, actually, I put the link as a hyperlink on my email signature. So that's how they found it. And it's when you get feedback about it. Someone gave me feedback about the podcast that was feedback like something to work on.
Oh yeah, even better.
Yeah, and even better. And immediately I thought, oh my goodness, what on earth are they going to say? But actually what they said was actually very, very pertinent and based on proper evidence. So they said that, when you're talking, rather than saying but and getting yourself in that manner, just pause and just so you can collect your thoughts together, because it sounds better when you're in your sort of flow. Then you've sort of lost your train of thought, but cover it up with a sort of a very powerful pause rather than using up. But it just doesn't sound. It sounds more fluid when you take the pause, which I thought at that time. I thought that's rubbish. That person doesn't know what they're talking about. But I listened back. I thought, actually, yeah, you're right.
Yeah,
I heard like but about 10 times. Now I've learned, especially when I'm speaking publicly now, is to take a pause if I lose my place.
Yeah.
So the feedback, actually, when it's something to work on, wasn't quite as anxiety inducing as I thought it might be.
I think in general the feedback that we've had's been sort of overwhelmingly positive, hasn't it? People are generally very positive about the podcast and what they get out of it. And I think, over time, obviously we've had more contributions and more engagement, and that's really helped as well.
So, getting into more examples, when someone says to you or brings up the fact they've listened to the podcast, what do you actually say to them? Do you have like go-to phrases that you use depending on who it is that's speaking to you about it?
I wouldn't say I do, no. As I said, I think I'll talk quite openly, quite honestly with people I'm close to, but I've had situations where it's been brought up in a group and there's been people in the group that I don't know, and they've gone, oh, you do a podcast? Oh, amazing. What's it about? And I don't know why. Sometimes that's a little bit much for me. I'm a bit, I should be happy to speak about it openly, but I'll keep it quite brief. I'll say, oh, it's a podcast about social anxiety. I do it with my friend Simon. And generally it doesn't go too much beyond that.
Because the intention is a positive intention.
Oh, absolutely.
Rather than it's a method of connection. There's no critique or criticism there. Although actually, if someone was to make a critique or criticism or whatever, I'd be quite interested.
Oh yeah.
Because there's always room to improve.
Absolutely.
I think that, if someone's showing interest in listening to the podcast, it means that what we're saying is connecting with people. And I think that it should feel really good. It doesn't always feel really good. It almost sometimes feels a bit like imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Because, when we look at, how many people download, they stream, they listen to it, there's thousands that listen to it. And, sometimes that feels like, well, why is that? Why are they bothering to do that? Because we always come back to that conversation we had right at the start. Or we think like 50 people will listen to it, but actually it's grown into quite the success, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that if we sort of transfer this now to people who may have similar, not difficulties is probably the wrong word, but things that they may struggle with in social situations. So whether it's about your work, your hobbies, and unexpected compliments.
Yeah.
So I think that's what we're coming round to. So sometimes it's good to have a response ready. So something as similar, oh, thanks very much, I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
That probably says it all. But then sometimes when I say that, I'm trying to read the other person, I'm thinking, oh my God, I probably should say something else. But I can't think of what else to say. So what am I going to say to them? So having stuff to go to is good, but not so good at the same time.
Yeah, I think also it's about how you view the interaction. I think sometimes it can be quite difficult to take a compliment. Sometimes the overthinking can kick in, where we start to wonder if really it's a critique or what are they trying to say. So I think if you can reframe it and see it as a chance of, well, this person obviously really values what I do, or this person genuinely enjoys what we do. Let me just take the critique, take the compliment, whatever it is, and turn it into a positive.
And I think it's okay to feel awkward. Awkward's normal. Although I don't know whether I'd frame it as awkward. Feeling awkward is awkward a feeling.
Yeah.
Sometimes I feel a bit embarrassed
Mm-hmm.
about it because I don't know what to say. And actually, it's coming back to that, the overall thing about, we decided to do this in the first place. We had that conversation. We're talking over 2 years ago now. We had that conversation and we did it.
Yeah.
And then it definitely wasn't right on episode 1. It wasn't quite there, but the fact it's still going nearly 2 years later.
Yeah. I think, just being proud of putting yourself out there, be proud if you've done something out of your comfort zone, if you've put yourself out there. This podcast was a bit of a chance rush, weren't quite sure how it was going to go, and it sort of could apply to so many situations. If you have to do a bit of public speaking, it doesn't really matter if it goes well or it doesn't. The fact is you still did it and you should still be proud that you did it.
I think that's a good place to end on for today's episode of Social Anxiety Life. And we hope that this episode has resonated with you, especially if you've felt the mix of excitement and panic when someone brings up your work.
Yes. As always, we would love you to share any stories with us, give us feedback. Any sort of contributions for future episodes are always welcomed.
You've been listening to Social Anxiety Life with Simon and Sarah. Subscribe, rate, and share the podcast to help people feel more seen and supported.
Until next time.
Thanks very much.
Bye.